All right, so we're here with Jill Meller from MTR Corporation, and as we were talking off camera, you mentioned something about science-based targets, right?
Yes.
So what does that really mean, and how does that fit into either an overall ESG strategy or your company strategy, just like in terms of general revenue generation and projects, et cetera?
Sure. So science-based targets are really targets for reducing your carbon emissions in a way that is in line with the overall Paris target of a global temperature increase of 1.5 degrees. And when we reset our ESG strategy a couple of years ago, reducing our carbon emissions was one of the pillars under our green pillar, or one of the focus areas under our green pillar. And we asked ourselves, could we align with the Hong Kong government, who has its own carbon neutrality target for 2050? And if we could, what would that look like? What would it mean in terms of the way that we operated our railway, the technology we would need to use, the way that we build extensions to our railway line? And we really carried out an exercise to challenge ourselves in that regard.
Okay.
We figured that we probably could hit carbon neutrality by 2050, but two things sort of stopped us from doing that. One was it had a huge price tag attached to it, and going to the board of directors at this time to say, look, can I have X billion dollars of funding to get us to carbon neutrality by 2050 would have been a pretty hard sell, even though I think I can be reasonably persuasive. And the second thing is who knows what's going to happen in that time frame. And there's a couple of big uncertainties. I think one particularly in Hong Kong is in relation to the potential opening up of the electricity network here. So the current scheme of control expires in 2033, and we don't know what might happen then in terms of access to greener electricity. And the second thing is, from a technology perspective, again, how do we know what the world is going to look like beyond sort of the 2030 timeframe? So we've recently at MTR trialled a hydrogen-powered light rail vehicle, just on a trial basis at the moment, to really see, does the technology work? What does it need to work safely? And how can we help government put up a regulatory framework in place for the use of hydrogen? But this could become the norm in the slightly longer timeframe. And so we decided instead to set ourselves targets for 2030. Because that was a manageable time frame, it had a manageable budget attached to it, and it was something we could get the support of our board for. So we have targets for our railway business in Hong Kong, our property business in Hong Kong, and also our Scope 3 targets, which includes some of our international operations as well.
So the hydrogen idea kind of fascinates me, not just because of the technology, which I'm sure is very cool, but you mentioned, again, the legal geek in me. You mentioned how there's no legal framework for that type of use of technology. And that's been an issue in places like Hong Kong, I mean, really anywhere, in terms of introduction of maybe more sustainable energy or other types of things, actually requires a legal framework around that in order for it to operate. And so I think it's interesting that, MTR can play a role in terms of maybe advocating or working with the government to first identify possible technologies, potentially implement and trial those things, but then also work on the regulatory framework. But one thing that I think is also a real consideration is that all comes at a significant cost, right? You're not an R&D center for Hong Kong, right? You're a listed company. And so I'm curious how internally you all have decided to kind of fund these types of projects and what that looks like and how that fits into your various business model.
Sure. So in the short term, certainly to 2030, there is a cost attached to the setting and meeting of these science-based targets. And we had to look at what were the different initiatives we could introduce in the different parts of our business to hit those targets. So things like replacing the chillers in our railway network, so the chillers that support our air conditioning system. And living in Hong Kong, it would be very hard to operate a largely underground metro system without air conditioning in the summer months. Changing out the light bulbs, installing solar power, but trying other technology, things like regenerative braking, which is capturing the energy that our trains release as they brake, and trying to somehow clean up that energy and put it back into the energy network. So lots of different technology that in the short term does certainly come at a cost, but we do believe over the longer time frame, as you're looking out to 2040 and 2050, it's worth investing in these initiatives now to become more energy efficient, to reduce our emissions, so that in the future, when things like carbon taxes may come along or carbon trading, we'll be best prepared for that.
Okay, so let's say that a business unit comes to you and they say, hey, we've got these buses or whatever it might be, and they're going to replace them because the time has come. And there's multiple options, and they're trying to choose between something that may be within their budget, but it's diesel-powered, or something, the existing kind of general technology, versus something that may be hydrogen or electric or other things which are more sustainable, but more expensive, at least in the short term.
Yes.
How do you kind of balance those incentives, and how do you, to the extent that you want to go with the more expensive option, how do you make that work?
Yes. So what we did was work with our board of directors to set aside a sum of money every year as what we call an ESG fund.
Okay.
And this is a fund that's kind of administered by my team, and people can apply to the fund either to fund a specific environmental or social initiative that doesn't have an economic return at this stage, or if they were to spend a little bit more money, it would improve its environmental or social performance. So the e-bus is a fantastic example. Our transport services business unit would have a budget to replace the buses like for like. If they want to buy e-buses instead, which makes sense, there is a small incremental cost to that, and they can come to the ESG fund to apply for that additional funding.
Yeah.
So what we've developed is an environmental and a social scorecard to assess each of these funding applications. And we've tried to make it as quantitative as possible, which is easier where you're looking at things like carbon emission reductions, because you can say, to what extent does this particular initiative help me achieve my science-based targets? On the social side, it's a little bit more challenging, but we have tried to bring in sort of more quantitative elements and to really focus on to what extent will this investment help us achieve the targets that we've set ourselves, the KPIs under our ESG framework. And so we have 4 meetings a year where a collective group of representatives from across all of the different business units and corporate functions assess these applications and decide where we put our funding. And generally there's a focus on the environmental side, because the environmental initiatives just have a bigger price tag attached to them. But having said that, there is a portion of the funding that we reserve for social initiatives. So we've recently implemented a 1-year internship programme for people with disabilities or people from ethnic minority backgrounds, and the funding for that again came from our ESG fund. We then report back to our board, Environmental and Social Responsibility Committee, twice a year, and up to the board once a year, on how we spent that money to make sure it's been spent on the right things.
It's so well organized and planned out. I think it's very cool to kind of hear the structure. Clearly, a lot of thought has gone into all this, and so I think that's probably speaks to why you and your teams have been successful in terms of convincing the board and your various stakeholders like to allow this stuff, because it feels like every step of the way it's been very, very carefully measured. I am curious though. So let's say even if it's a transition from diesel to some other form of bus, people are often resistant to change, right? And again, maybe this is an unfair characteristic, but I often think that some of the folks in Hong Kong maybe sometimes were a little bit more resistant to change, and maybe that's not fair. Maybe it's just the realities, and maybe it's everywhere. But how well has your workforce taken to this idea? Do you get a lot of applications? Is it something you have to kind of push people to do? Are they very excited about the opportunity to apply for these types of things? I'm just curious because at the university, for example, we have, many types of opportunities where we can apply for funding and various things. And it's often seen as more work, and there's no additional benefit or internal incentive for people to engage. And so sometimes that money doesn't get used, or people, the take-up isn't as much as might have originally been expected. So I'm just curious from a private sector perspective, how do people at MTR kind of perceive that?
Of course, and this comes back, doesn't it, to the human element, really, of how do you get people on the bus, as my team sort of describe it, to support the environmental and social direction that the company is wanting to go in. And so all credit to my team, I think, who have done a huge amount of work, to work out from a really a David Bishop perspective, what do you care about? Is it the environmental side? Is it the social side? Why do you care about it? What, therefore, can I get you interested in, in working with us on that will get you on the bus? And I don't really care, in some ways, kind of why you're on the bus as long as you're on it. And so we've run, over the course of the last 3 years, a series of internal engagement exercises. So we had a social inclusion week, we've had a green week, and next year we're planning an advancement and opportunities week. And this has been a week where we've run a series of exercises that staff could get involved in. We've done everything from concerts for staff at lunchtime. We've had a marketplace with NGOs coming in and selling their products. Our lifts were sort of plastered with stickers talking about social inclusion. Why is this important to us as MTR? Why is it important to us as a corporate? What are the KPIs we've set ourselves? How are we going to meet them, and how can you help us meet them? But also, how can you take some of this thinking into your day-to-day life? So how can you take what you've learned about recycling into the way that you manage your recycling at home? How can you take some of the work we're doing around an intergenerational workforce to help you have better conversations with your kids. So it's really to get staff to understand, why is this important to us, how can they contribute, but also what can they get out of it. And so through that engagement exercise, we're by no means there, and it's a continuous exercise. If you work in this space, I think you have to be resilient.
Yeah.
There are often roadblocks, you get pushback in relation to different areas. But I think we've generally got to a good place.
Yeah.
And I would hope that the bulk of our staff could at least name, our 3 environmental and social objectives, and hopefully a number of those focus areas that sit underneath those.
Yeah. So it's a great lesson in communication. Again, it's not just about what is decided at the top. It's really that message in the middle and kind of communicating downward, and really managing expectations. One thing I did not tell Jill is that a few weeks ago, I did training for staff at MTR. And it was on stakeholder engagement.
Yes.
And I will say, as the objective external party, everybody actually, the communication was very clearly aligned. I feel like compared to other companies that I teach, they knew exactly who their core stakeholders were.
Yes.
And I feel like they were able to communicate a lot of these ideas. And so I think that is obviously the first step, right? And then internalization and really applying that. So it's a little more challenging thing. But yeah, so the messaging is working.
It's good to hear.
Yeah, and appreciate you sharing that with us today.